There is a saying among old librarians, the kind who spend their lives beneath stone ceilings and dust that predates empires. They say that every book eventually finds the hand it was written for. It might take a decade, it might take a century, it might take 400 years, but the book waits, patient as bone, until the right person opens it. Mirelle Voss had been the palace's chief archivist for 11 years, and in that time she had come to believe the saying was mostly nonsense. A comfort librarians told themselves to make the endless cataloging feel like destiny instead of drudgery. She had shelved and reshelved thousands of volumes in the under-archive of the Thessaline Palace, the great glass and basalt seat of the Cathalani royal line, rulers not of human blood, but of something taller, paler, older, with eyes like still water, and a habit of looking through people rather than at them. The Cathalani had sat the throne for 4 centuries. Everyone knew that. It was taught in every schoolroom on the continent, human and alien alike. 400 years of unbroken succession, an empire so stable it had become synonymous with permanence itself. Mirelle did not care much about thrones. She cared about the spine of a book, cracking gently under her thumb, about the smell of old vellum, about the particular satisfaction of finding a mislabeled ledger and returning it to its rightful place on a shelf no one had touched in a generation. She was 43 years old, unmarried, quietly content, and entirely invisible to the nobles and officials who passed through the palace's upper halls. She liked it that way. Invisibility was a kind of peace. She worked 2 floors below the throne room in a wing of the palace, so old that the current Cathalani dynasty had never bothered to fully catalog it. The under-archive was hers alone, a maze of shelving that curved away into shadow, lit by soft lumen glass globes that had not been replaced in decades because no one remembered they were still burning down there. She liked the quiet. She liked the smell. She liked that no one ever came looking for her, because it meant no one ever asked her to explain herself. That was the world, as it stood when she found the book that would end it. It happened on an unremarkable afternoon, the kind that blurred into every other afternoon of her working life. She had been assigned, almost as an afterthought, to catalog a crate of genealogical records unearthed during renovations to the Old West cellars. Palace bureaucracy required every scrap of parchment to be logged before it could be disposed of or archived properly, and genealogies were the dullest of all possible assignments, endless lists of names and marriages and deaths that mattered to no one still living. She had expected to spend a week sorting through faded family trees belonging to minor courtiers who had been dust for centuries. Instead, near the bottom of the crate, wrapped in oilcloth, gone brittle and yellow, she found a book that had no catalog number, no library mark, no indication it had ever been shelved at all. She almost set it aside. It looked at first glance like nothing important, a modest volume bound in dark leather with a spine worn smooth by handling that had stopped happening a very long time ago. But something about the way it had been wrapped, the care of it, the deliberate placement at the very bottom of a crate full of forgettable paperwork made her pause. Librarians develop an instinct for what has been hidden versus what has simply been forgotten. This had been hidden. She opened it there, in the dim light of the under-archive, sitting cross-legged on the stone floor, because she had not thought to bring a chair, and she began to read. It was a genealogy, like the others, but older, written in a formal court hand that had gone out of fashion 500 years before. It traced a bloodline of Cathalani nobility, a family called the Ferenoth, who Mirelle vaguely recognized from a single footnote in a history text she had read years ago, a family described as having gone extinct in some unspecified calamity before the current dynasty took the throne. She read on. The book was meticulous, the kind of genealogical record kept by scribes, who understood that lineage was law among the Cathalani, that succession was not merely tradition, but sacred structure, encoded into their oldest legal codes. Blood rights superseded conquest. It superseded even the will of a sitting monarch. A throne taken without blood right was, by the Cathalani's own ancient law, no throne at all, merely an occupation. The book traced the Ferenoth line down through 6 generations, Marriages, births, one especially detailed page describing a wedding between the last acknowledged Heir and a court official of no particular note. And then, near the final pages, in a different hand, hurried and cramped, where the rest had been careful and slow, there was an addendum, a birth recorded outside the palace, in secrecy. In the same year, the history books claimed the Pharaoh line had been extinguished in what was officially described as a fever that swept through their household. Mirelle sat very still on the cold stone floor. She read the addendum 3 times. It named an infant, sex unspecified for safety, sent from the palace under cover of a plague quarantine, delivered into the care of a minor merchant family in a distant province, its true parentage sealed and its name changed. With a final line written in ink, so faded she had to angle the page toward the light to make out the words. The line read, "Let the throne believe the blood is gone. Let it sleep until it is safe to wake." She closed the book. She sat there in the dark for a long time, longer than she could later account for, feeling the particular vertigo of holding something too large for her hands. If this record was authentic, and every fiber of her archivist training told her it was, then the Cathalaugian dynasty, currently seated on the Thessaline throne, the dynasty that had ruled for 400 years, that had built roads and armies and treaties on the foundation of its own unbroken legitimacy, was not the rightful bloodline at all. It was a line that had taken the throne after the true heirs had been driven into hiding and presumed dead. Everyone, human and Cathalaugian both, had believed the Pharaoh extinct for 4 centuries. Someone, somewhere, 400 years ago, had lied about that, and someone, apparently, had wanted the lie to end eventually. Or they would never have preserved the proof at all. They would have burned it. Mirelle did not sleep well that night, she told herself, as she lay staring at the ceiling of her small apartment within the palace staff quarters, that this was not her problem. She was a librarian. She catalogued things. She did not decide the fates of empires. The rational thing to do was log the book under some innocuous classification, bury it 3 levels deeper in the archive than it had been before, and let 400 years of settled history remain settled. But she thought of that final line, "Let it sleep until it is safe to wake." Someone had written that with the clear intention that one day someone else would read it. Someone had trusted the future with a secret they could not act on themselves. And now, the future had arrived in the form of a middle-aged archivist sitting alone on a stone floor, and she found she could not simply close the book and pretend the trust had not been placed in her. She spent the next several weeks in a state she could only describe to herself as quiet obsession. She told no one. She continued her normal duties, cataloging, shelving, answering the rare question from a passing clerk, all while carrying the knowledge of the book like a stone lodged behind her ribs. In her off hours, she pursued the thread the addendum had left her, cross-referencing old provincial tax rolls, merchant family records, church registries from the province the infant had supposedly been sent to. It was slow work, the kind of work she was built for, patient and exacting. And she told herself she was only trying to determine whether the record was even credible before she did anything as reckless as act on it. But some part of her already knew what she would find, because the alternative, that the trail simply died and the secret stayed buried, felt wrong in a way she could not fully articulate. The book had been protected too carefully for its story to end in a dead branch. It took her 19 days to trace the descent forward through 4 centuries of ordinary lives, merchants and farmers and, twice, minor clerks, the bloodline thinning and drifting and changing names twice more along the way, until it arrived, astonishingly, back inside the very palace where it had begun. The final entry she could piece together from public record was a scribe, employed in the lower administrative archive, 2 floors below Mirelle's own domain, who had taken the position 8 years earlier under a name that matched with a little genealogical squinting the family the secret bloodline had most recently worn. The scribe's name was Corinne Adley. Mirelle had passed them in the corridor 100 times without a second thought. They kept records for the palace's tax and land offices, a quiet, unremarkable position that suited someone who, as far as anyone in the world knew, had no history worth remarking on at all. She did not go to them immediately. She sat with the knowledge for another 2 weeks, turning it over the way she turned over any find before committing it to a shelf, checking and rechecking. Because to be wrong about this, to hand a stranger a piece of paper that upended their entire understanding of who they were, was not something she could do carelessly. She verified the merchant family records twice more. She found a baptismal entry in a crumbling provincial church ledger that matched a name, 3 generations back from Corin, close enough that it could not reasonably be coincidence. She found in a moment that made her hands shake for the first time since this had started, a small personal detail buried in a tax appeal Corin had filed years earlier, mentioning a grandmother's insistence on a strange old family custom of naming children after long-dead relatives whose names appeared, unmistakably, in the very genealogy Mirelle now kept locked in her desk. The evidence had assembled itself into something undeniable. The extinct bloodline was not extinct. It had been hiding in plain sight generation after generation inside the walls of the very palace that had stolen its throne, and it did not even know its own name. Mirelle understood, somewhere around the 3rd week, that she had stopped being merely a librarian who had found an interesting document. She had become the only living person who knew that the Cathrani throne currently occupied by the reigning dynasty was by their own ancient and unbroken law, illegitimate. She understood, too, the danger folded into that knowledge. 400 years was a long time for a lie to calcify into truth. There would be people, powerful people, entire structures of government and military and church, who had a vested interest in the lie remaining exactly as settled as it appeared. If this went wrong, if it went to the wrong ears before the right ones, both she and the scribe 2 floors below her could simply disappear, filed away as quietly as any misplaced document, and no one would ever ask the question that mattered. She thought about burning the book more than once. It would have been the safe thing. It would have let her go back to her quiet, invisible life among the shelves, and let the world keep believing the comfortable lie it had believed for 4 centuries. She did not burn it. On a gray morning in early autumn, when the corridors of the lower administrative wing were quiet, with the particular hush of a workday not yet fully begun, Mirelle Voss walked down 2 flights of narrow stone stairs, carrying a book wrapped once more in its brittle oilcloth, and she found Corin Adley exactly where the records said they would be, hunched over a ledger, at a scarred wooden desk in a small windowless office that smelled of ink and dust. Corin looked up when she entered, mildly surprised, because archivists from the upper wing rarely had reason to descend into the tax office. They were younger than Mirelle by perhaps 15 years, plain-featured, unremarkable in every visible way, with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers, and the slightly stooped posture of someone who spent all day bent over numbers that mattered to everyone but them. Mirelle did not sit, she did not explain. She had turned the moment over in her mind for weeks, imagining a dozen speeches, careful preambles that would ease Corin into the weight of what she carried, gentle framing that would soften the impossible size of it. In the end, standing in that small office with the book heavy in her hands, none of the speeches felt right. They all felt like a kind of theft, taking from Corin the experience of discovering it themselves, in their own time, in their own silence. So she simply set the book down on the desk, atop the ledger Corin had been working on, and she said the only sentence she had decided in the end was necessary. "You should read the marked page." Corin blinked at her, confused, glancing between Mirelle's face and the unfamiliar old book now resting on their desk. They opened their mouth to ask a question, and Mirelle, already turning toward the door, did not wait to hear it. She had decided, walking down those 2 flights of stairs, that this was the one part of the discovery that was not hers to narrate. The book would speak for itself, or it would not speak at all, and either way the truth deserved to land on Corin without her voice, shaping how it fell. She left the office and did not look back, though every instinct in her told her to. She spent the rest of that day unable to concentrate on anything. She shelved books in the wrong order twice, something she had not done in a decade. She found herself standing in front of a section of Cathrani legal codes she had catalogued years earlier, rereading passages on blood right and succession that she had once found dry and academic, and now found terrifying in their plainness. The law was not ambiguous. It had never been ambiguous. It had simply been convenient. For 4 centuries, for everyone to forget it existed. Corinne did not come to find her that day, nor the next. Mirelle told herself this was reasonable. She had, essentially, handed a stranger a piece of information capable of unmaking their entire identity, and walked away without explanation. Of course, they needed time. She imagined Corinne sitting alone in that small office, long after the tax rolls had been put away, reading the marked page over and over, the way she herself had read it 3 times on a cold stone floor, trying to make the words rearrange themselves into something less enormous. On the 3rd day, there was a knock at the door of the underarchive, soft and hesitant, the kind of knock made by someone who half hoped no one would answer. Mirelle opened it to find Corinne standing in the corridor, the book clutched against their chest, their eyes red-rimmed in a way that suggested several sleepless nights rather than one. They did not speak immediately. They simply looked at her, searching her face for something, perhaps confirmation that this was real, and not some elaborate, cruel joke. Mirelle stepped back and let them in. They sat together in the quiet of the underarchive, surrounded by shelves that had stood undisturbed for longer than either of their families had known their true names. And Corinne finally found their voice, quiet and unsteady, asking the question that had clearly consumed every waking hour since Mirelle had left that book on their desk. They asked how she could possibly be certain. They asked whether this was some mistake, some trick of coincidence, a genealogy that happened to share names with their own family by pure, unlucky accident of history. Mirelle answered every question with the same patient thoroughness she brought to any piece of research, laying out the provincial tax rolls, the baptismal record, the naming custom mentioned in the old appeal, walking Corinne through 19 days of careful, methodical work that had led inevitably to the desk 2 floors below her own. She did not embellish, she did not need to. The evidence laid out plainly was its own kind of overwhelming. Corinne listened in silence, and when Mirelle finished, they sat with their head in their hands for a long moment, and when they finally looked up, their voice had changed. It was steadier, but hollowed out, the voice of someone standing at the edge of something too large to see the bottom of. They said that their grandmother used to tell them, when they were very young, that their family had once been someone, before something terrible happened, and they became no one, and that they should never repeat this to anyone outside the family because being someone had gotten people killed once already. Corinne had always assumed it was the kind of story poor families told themselves to feel less small. A comfort like Mirelle's librarians and their patient books. They had never once considered it might be literal. Mirelle told them that she understood the impulse to disbelieve it. She told them that she had spent weeks trying to disprove her own findings before she ever came down those stairs, precisely because she understood what it would mean if she was right, and she had not wanted to hand someone a truth that might destroy them, if it was even slightly wrong. But it was not wrong. She had checked everything a librarian could check, and everything held. It was Corinne who asked, eventually, the question that mattered more than any genealogical detail. They asked what they were supposed to do with this. They were a tax scribe. They had no army, no allies among the nobility, no standing in any court, human or Kathrani. The dynasty currently on the throne had 4 centuries of institutional power behind it, a standing military, a church that had blessed their rule for generations, and Corinne was by every measure the world used to judge such things. Nobody at all. Mirelle told them quietly that the book itself seemed to disagree. Someone 400 years ago had risked everything to preserve this record instead of simply letting the lie stand unchallenged forever, and they had done it with no guarantee that anyone would ever read it, let alone act on it. That kind of patience was its own form of faith. Whoever hid that book believed. Across 4 centuries. God knew how many descendants who would never know what they carried, that the truth mattered enough to survive even if it had to wait a very long time to matter out loud. Corinne sat with that for a while. Then they asked Mirelle plainly whether she believed the truth should come out at all, given what it might cost, given the chaos it could unleash on a stable and, whatever its origins, largely peaceful realm. Mirelle answered honestly. She said she did not know what should happen to the throne. She was not qualified to weigh empires. But she knew, with total certainty that she could not have kept the secret and slept easy for the rest of her life, and she suspected, watching Corin's face, that they felt the same pull, now, however frightening it was. Some truths did not ask permission before they became your responsibility, they simply arrived, and then the only real choice left was what kind of person you would be while carrying them. They talked for hours that day, long after the last of the palace's daylight staff had gone home, sitting among the shelves in the soft glow of the old lumen globes. Mirelle found herself, for the first time in 11 years of solitary work, grateful for company in her archive. And she suspected Corin, who had spent years quietly filing tax records in a windowless room, felt something similar, the strange relief of no longer being entirely alone with an impossible thing. Ward did not travel quickly because neither of them wanted it to. They understood, without needing to say it aloud, that this could not be shouted into the palace corridors. It had to be handled the way Mirelle handled everything, carefully, with evidence assembled and verified before it was ever presented to eyes that might have reason to make the problem disappear rather than solve it. Over the following months, the two of them worked in a kind of quiet partnership that neither had expected to find at their respective stages of life. Mirelle brought her research skills, her access to records, her patient understanding of how to trace a truth through layers of deliberate obscuring. Corin, once the shock had settled into something closer to resolve, brought a surprising steadiness and a knowledge of the palace's administrative underbelly that proved more useful than either of them had anticipated. A tax scribe, it turned out, saw things that nobles never did. They saw which officials skimmed, which departments quietly resented the current dynasty, which old aristocratic families still nursed private grudges against the Kathrani throne for slights 4 centuries old, families who might, if approached carefully, have their own reasons to want the old blood-right law tested, rather than left comfortably buried. It was Corin, in fact, who found the second piece of corroborating evidence, buried in an old land dispute filed by a minor noble house 200 years earlier, a filing that referenced, almost in passing, a rumor of the Faranoth line's survival that the crown at the time had moved swiftly and quietly to suppress. It was not proof on its own, but it was another thread in a growing rope, and Mirelle recognized in Corin, watching them work, the same instinct she had spent her career developing. The instinct to pull a thread until the whole tapestry revealed itself, however long that took. They did not act rashly. Mirelle counseled patience, the same patience the original book had asked of its readers, and Corin, to their credit, did not push back against it, even though the weight of what they now knew about themselves must have made every day of waiting feel unbearable. But they both understood that a claim this large, made too soon or too loudly, would simply be crushed, the evidence seized and destroyed, the two of them quietly reassigned to some distant provincial posting or worse, and the 400-year lie would simply continue, a little more carefully guarded than before. Instead, they'd built their case the way Mirelle built every case in her professional life, brick by brick, record by record, until it could not be dismissed as coincidence or forgery by anyone with the patience to actually examine it. The moment it finally moved beyond the two of them came nearly a year after Mirelle had first opened that oilcloth wrapping on the cold stone floor of the Underarchive. A senior legal scholar attached to the palace's own Ministry of Records, a woman named Dessa Kelleran, who had spent her career studying Kathrani succession law and had grown quietly disillusioned with a court she found increasingly indifferent to the very traditions it claimed to honor, was approached by Mirelle under careful pretense. Framed initially as a hypothetical academic question about the legal weight of an old blood-right claim, if such a claim were ever proven. Kelleran, sharp enough to recognize immediately that this was no hypothetical, demanded to see the evidence, and Mirelle, after long deliberation with Corin, decided the risk of trust was smaller than the risk of standing still forever. Kelleran spent 3 days, locked in a private study with a book and every supporting document Mirelle and Corin had gathered, and when she emerged, her face had the particular pallor of someone who has just watched the foundation of their entire professional life crack open in front of them. She told them plainly that the claim, if it withstood formal challenge, was airtight under the Crown's own ancient legal code. She told them, too, that presenting it publicly and unprepared would get all three of them killed, quietly and efficiently, before the sun set on the day they tried. What followed was not the explosive confrontation Mirelle had once feared, some dramatic unveiling before a shocked throne room. It was slower than that, and in its own way, more remarkable. Caloran, using her standing within the ministry, began quietly building formal legal groundwork, drafting the case as a matter of legitimate succession law rather than rebellion, framing it not as an attack on the crown, but as a correction the crown's own ancient code demanded of itself. She brought in carefully, and, one at a time, a small handful of other officials and scholars she trusted, people who had their own quiet grievances with a dynasty that had grown, over 4 centuries, increasingly distant and indifferent to the traditions it claimed to embody. Some of the old aristocratic houses, the ones with long memories and older resentments, proved unexpectedly receptive once approached with genuine, verifiable evidence rather than rumor. It took another 8 months to build a case robust enough to bring before the Cathalani High Court of Succession, an ancient body that technically still existed, still held formal authority over questions of bloodright, and had simply not been asked to rule on anything of consequence in living memory because no one had ever seriously challenged the current dynasty's legitimacy. The reigning monarch, an aloof and confident figure named Heir, who had inherited the throne assuming, as every Cathalani ruler before them had assumed, that the question of legitimacy had been settled 4 centuries earlier and would never need revisiting, did not take the challenge seriously at first. Ward reached the throne of some administrative curiosity being raised in the succession court, and they, according to those present, laughed at the report and told his ministers to let the old scholars have their academic exercise, confident that 400 years of precedent could not possibly be undone by paperwork. It was, Mirelle thought later, the same mistake every entrenched power eventually makes. They mistake the appearance of settled truth for the reality of it, and they forget that settled things can still be reopened by anyone patient enough to do the work properly. The formal hearing, when it finally came, was unlike anything the palace had seen in generations. Mirelle stood before the High Court of Succession herself, called as the discovering archivist, and gave testimony in the same, plain, exacting manner she used to describe any piece of research, laying out 19 days of tracing, a year of corroboration, document after document presented without embellishment, because the truth by that point did not need embellishing. Corin stood beside her, no longer a nervous tax scribe hiding in a windowless office, but the last acknowledged descendant of the Faranoth line, and when the court's genealogical examiners completed their own independent verification, cross-checking every record Mirelle and Kelleran had gathered against the Crown's own archives, they found nothing to contradict it and a great deal to confirm it. The Heir's ministers, watching the case build with mounting alarm, attempted late and clumsily to discredit the findings, producing hastily assembled counter-genealogies that the court's examiners dismantled within a single session, their inconsistencies too obvious, too recently constructed, to survive serious scrutiny. It was, Mirelle noted with the dry, quiet satisfaction of someone whose entire profession was built on catching exactly this kind of forgery. An amateur's mistake. 4 centuries of unchallenged rule had left the current dynasty unpracticed at the very thing that had originally secured their throne. They had simply never expected to need those old skills again. The High Court of Succession, bound by its own ancient code and unable in good conscience to ignore evidence this thoroughly documented, issued its ruling on a cold morning in late winter, nearly 2 years after Mirelle had first knelt on the stone floor of the under-archive and opened a book no one had touched in 400 years. The ruling was formal, careful, couched in the dense legal language of a code, far older than the dynasty had now unseated, but its substance was simple and absolute. The Faranoth bloodline was confirmed. The current dynasty's original claim to the throne, 4 centuries past, was found to have been founded on the deliberate suppression of a legitimate heir, and under the Crown's own bloodright law. Such a founding rendered the succession that followed void from its very root. It did not mean armies marched or blood was shed in the streets. The Kothrani, for all their 4 centuries of rule, respected their own legal architecture too deeply and too publicly to simply ignore a high court ruling once it was issued, not without unmaking the very legitimacy of law itself. Thessarian Vey, to his credit, or perhaps simply to preserve what dignity remained available to him, stepped down rather than force a conflict he could not legally win, and the transition, while tense and closely watched by every faction in the realm, proceeded largely without violence. Guided by Kaloran's careful legal framework, and by the quiet fact that too many of the old houses had already thrown their support behind the restored bloodline to make resistance practical, Corin Adley, once a tax scribe 2 floors below the palace's main archive, was formally recognized as the last living descendant of the Ferenoth line and ascended in a ceremony that Mirelle attended standing quietly near the back of the Great Hall, exactly where she had always felt most comfortable, far from the center of attention and close enough to see everything. She watched Corin, dressed in robes that still seemed to sit unfamiliarly on their shoulders, take the ancient oath of the Ferenoth throne, and she thought about the scribe who had written that final line 400 years earlier, "Let it sleep until it is safe to wake," and she wondered if that long-dead hand could have imagined, even for a moment, that the sleeping heir would be found by another quiet scribe in another quiet room 4 centuries later. In the months that followed, Corin insisted, over the objections of several court officials who found the idea faintly scandalous, that Mirelle be granted a formal position within the new court, not as a courtier or minister, roles she wanted no part of, but as royal archivist, with full authority over the palace's records, and full protection to pursue whatever forgotten truths still slept in its lower shelves. Mirelle accepted, on the sole condition that she be allowed to keep her office in the underarchive, the same dim, quiet room where she had spent 11 years of her life before a crate of forgotten paperwork changed the shape of an empire. She still worked there most days, among the same shelves, the same soft lumen glass, the same smell of old parchment and dust. But now, once a week or so, Corin would descend the 2 flights of stairs themselves, no longer merely a scribe visiting an archivist, but a monarch visiting a friend, and they would sit together in the quiet the way they had on that first impossible day, and talk about nothing in particular. Mirelle kept the original book in a case of its own, not locked away in some ceremonial vault, but placed on a low shelf in her own office, where she could see it whenever she looked up from her desk. She had thought, once, that finding it had been the end of something, the closing of an old and dangerous secret. She understood now that it had been a beginning instead, one that had waited 400 patient years for exactly the right hands to carry it forward. She never did learn who had written that final hurried line in the addendum, whose hand had wrapped the book in oilcloth and buried it at the bottom of a crate destined for a cellar no one would think to search for centuries. She thought about that person often. Some nameless scribe, some frightened servant of a dying house, who had trusted a future they would never see, trusted it enough to preserve a truth they themselves could never act on. She liked to think that whoever it was would have approved of how it finally happened, not with armies or fire, but with patience, with careful research, with one librarian's quiet refusal to let a discovered truth simply go back to sleep. Sometimes in the evenings, she would take the book down from its shelf, open it to the marked page and read the line once more, though she now knew it by heart. Let it sleep until it is safe to wake. She would look at it for a long moment, and then she would close the book gently and set it back in its place, exactly where it belonged. If you enjoyed this story, there are more like it waiting for you, tales of quiet people who turn out to carry the weight of history in their hands without ever asking for it. Let me know in the comments what part of Mirelle and Corin's story stayed with you the most. Consider subscribing if you want more stories like this one, and I will see you in the next tale.